Hey folks, Tim Ferriss here. I thought I would talk a little bit about accelerated learning in specifically the capacity of memorizing foreign vocabularies. How do you learn a language? I've thought a lot about this, and I thought I was terrible at languages up until about 15. I had done very poorly at Spanish, and when I moved from one school to another, I had a chance to choose from other languages. And since I had friends who were going into Japanese, I figured, well, if I'm going to fail in languages, I might as well fail in a class where my friends are at least in the same room. I went to Japanese and eventually went to Japan as an exchange student. And that triggered an entire discovery of my own ability to learn languages and your ability to learn languages. I was not bad at languages, I just had the wrong method. I had teachers who really weren't enabling me to create approaches that would make the language stick. So I'm going to help you with a few different approaches and examples that I've used over and over and over again. So I'm not going to talk about learning languages ad nauseum in every respect, because that could be hours and hours long. If you want some of that, I highly recommend that you just go to tim.blog. There's a topics section and it has language learning. I have a bunch of different articles that I've written, as well as articles by Benny Lewis, who's fantastic. The Irish Polyglot is his nickname, and a handful of other folks, which are spectacular and have links and links and links to tons of resources. I'm going to talk about vocab because most people are very intimidated by learning a high volume of words. And if you approach it the right way, you can actually learn hundreds of words per day if you wanted to make that effectively your full-time job. If you want to make it just a part-time gig, you can still learn 10 to 100 words per day if you really make an effort of it. And if you do that, you don't have to learn 100,000 words. To be functionally, conversationally fluent in a given language, meaning you can hold a long conversation, you really only need about 2,000 words. Very rough approximation, and there are some fantastic flashcards, for instance, from companies like VizEd, VIS-ED.com, which compiles the flashcards from high-frequency word lists based on usage in newspapers, books, and so on. What I would say, though, is that this is best illustrated by example. So rather than rote, i.e. the repetition of this in English is this in Spanish, this in English is this in Spanish, and just hoping that that is going to gain a foothold in your mind, let's just say cow and vaca, V-A-C-A. All right, so vaca is cow, vaca, vaca, cow, etc. How would you remember this? We are highly visually adapted. We are evolved to be very visually acute, and we are driven that way, and our memory is highly tagged and cued by any type of imagery. So what I would suggest in such a case is that you use something that has been nicknamed the link word mnemonic. There are other ways to label it. Really all this entails is creating a link between the words that is image-based. So if we have a word like vaca, and I would encourage you when you're first learning vocab to the extent possible not to fixate on the spelling because it can throw you off. Vaca, vaca, what does that sound like? Vacuum, maybe. All right, so what could you imagine? You could imagine cow, because you want to use the Q in English, because if you can recall the Spanish, let's say, in this case, from English, you can always recognize the Spanish, but not vice versa, which is why if you're looking in a book and it has, say, the Spanish terms listed first and then the English terms listed, I wouldn't use it. I would switch the order. So I would even use a piece of paper, potentially, to cover up the Spanish and only use the English as a cue, as your native language. So, vaca. Let's imagine that there is a cow and it has a really oddly shaped head that looks like the end of a vacuum and it's sucking up the grass on the ground. All right? So it's cow with a head like a vacuum sucking up grass. Cow, vacuum, vaca. All right? That would be a very simple example. Other approaches you could take, which are a little more flexible, but more or less the same thing. If you have something much more complicated, so let's say you have a term like momaku hakuri. Momaku hakuri is detached retina in Japanese. So number one, you have something that's a lot longer. Momaku hakuri. All right, the hell does that sound like in English? Not a whole lot. It's also something a little more complex, detached retina. And what you realize quickly is that you generally just need a cue, which is why, for instance, you'll see a higher hit rate on the Wheel of Fortune if you give people the first few letters, then say the last few letters. So taking that as analogy, the way we would work with that is momaku hakuri. What does the first part sound like? Momaku, moma, MoMA. Okay, maybe it sounds like the MoMA. So you live in a place like San Francisco, New York, and the Museum of Modern Art. So it sounds like the MoMA. All right, well, you could imagine then people walking into the MoMA, looking at displays and just having their eyeballs blow out of their heads, okay? So just imagine a bunch of people walking into the MoMA and getting detached retinas because their eyeballs blow out of their heads and like splatter the paintings in front of them. All right, and then that, because you have MoMA, there's a decent chance that you will then remember momaku hakuri. And in the case of, say, Japanese, you have the characters which you would learn later, and it becomes even easier because you will be breaking that word into momaku hakuri into a few characters, okay? If you are learning, so that is how you would tackle, say, something that is slightly more complex in terms of a longer word, for instance. If you are learning a tonal language, such as Mandarin, so I've studied Mandarin and spent time in China at 2 universities, how should you learn tones? That is, of course, part of learning the vocabulary. This is something that just slaughters a lot of students of Chinese, particularly if they have lax teachers. So number one, you need merciless, hard-ass teachers because they will bludgeon you, and they should, into training your vocal cords to make the proper sound. I don't care how many times you hear something like yeshu, if you haven't developed the actual vocal cord ability, which is just like doing any type of stretching or strength training, you have to condition your throat to be able to make those sounds. You are SOL, you are shit out of luck. And if they don't reinforce that and force you to get it correct and train properly, you're going to do a lot of bad repetitions. And I met many students who, after 6 months of doing Chinese, had a ton of what they thought was great vocabulary. They went to China and nobody understood a thing they were saying. They had to start from scratch. So don't do that. Now we come down to choosing materials. And what I would say is that if possible, and this is an unpopular position, but you want to use a writing system in English, so the romanizing of, say, Chinese, that indicates the tone in the spelling. This is very controversial. So there's a system, for instance, called GR, which stands for Guoyu Roma Zi. And you would say have first tone in Chinese for guo, guo, G-U-O. Then guo, second tone, which would be country, like guoyu, country language, which is kind of a long story and will piss off a bunch of mainlanders, but that's okay. So guo, G-W-O. And then if I want to say qu guo, so he has gone, I have gone, guo, fourth tone, G-U-O-H. This helps dramatically with memorization of vocab and specifically retaining the tones. The more popular system that is used in textbooks for Chinese, for Mandarin, certainly probably for Cantonese too, is Pinyin. Pinyin is where you would have, say, this, guo, and then they would use a diacritical mark at the top to say guo, second tone, or fourth tone, guo, with these funky little lines on the top and the bottom. Students do not remember that stuff, from all I can tell and everything I've seen. The problem is, as a teacher in a university, you are oftentimes rewarded by how many students you can keep in a class or get to a passing grade. GR is a huge pain in the ass in the beginning. But if we're thinking like Abe Lincoln, if I'm given 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'll spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axe. You want to do the heavy lifting in the beginning so that you can have a much smoother ride later on. And in a tonal language, part of that is choosing the right romanization of that language. And in my opinion, GR is highly, highly, highly underrated. It's just a huge pain in the ass in the beginning. So you'll be very frustrated for the first couple weeks, maybe. And then looking back, if you actually stick with it, you'll think to yourself, my God, that was just a divine gift that I learned in GR instead of Pinyin. All right. And then there are, of course, the tools that if you want to space your repetition, even if it's practicing the recall of something like cow in Spanish. What was that? Cow, vacuum, vaca. right? Or if you're trying to think, detached retina, which you probably won't have much use for, but I learned it because I read comic books that had a lot of fighting in them to learn Japanese, since they talked about detached retinas a fair amount. Well, detached retinas, blowing onto the paintings, where? At the MoMA, Momaku Hakuri is detached retina. All right, but you still have to figure out how frequently, how often to use these types of, say, flashcards or cues. Remember that you're going to look at the English first, not the target language first. And there are many different things you could use. You could read an article, say, in Wired magazine written about super memo, which is a very fascinating spaced repetition approach. Super memo, which has then been turned into, say, software programs and apps like Anki, A-N-K-I, which in Japanese is actually rote memorization. So there's some irony to that. But Anki, A-N-K-I. And then, of course, and I'm biased here because I've been involved with the company and helped them, Duolingo. It is the most popular free language learning software on the planet, 100 million plus users, and they also have a separate app that is used for flashcards. So there are many different ways to approach this, many ways to learn languages, but it is my firm belief that if you approach it in a rational, methodical way, that you can become conversationally fluent in just about any language in 8 to 12 weeks. And that is coming from someone who gave up on Spanish for years and years and years. But now, having practiced with Chinese, Japanese, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Indonesian, i.e. Bahasa, I've played with and toyed with Turkish, Greek, all these languages for just a few weeks at a time for fun. In many cases, I believe 8 to 12 weeks, you can be conversationally fluent, or at the very least functional, in almost any language, certainly any language that I've encountered. So that should be very reassuring. You can tackle many, many languages, not just one. And if you learn another language, just one additional language, you have a brand new lens through which to view everything in life. Your thinking changes, your perspective changes, your empathy changes. So if you're trying to figure out a way to hack your lifespan, think about all these drugs, metformin, rapamycin, whatever, you think about all these ways you might double your lifespan. Well, one way you can do it right now is by learning a second language. So, Godspeed, good luck. I hope that helps. And if you want more on mnemonic devices, certainly I wrote quite a bit about mnemonic devices and learning things like languages in the 4-Hour Chef, because it's actually a book on accelerated learning. There's also a fantastic book by, I believe the name is Higbee. I haven't read it in decades, Your Memory and How to Improve It. It's an excellent, excellent book on tactical and very concrete mnemonic devices that have been used for centuries that are very easy to implement. So there you have it, folks. Good luck. Ganbatte kudasai, as they would say in Japanese. Good luck. Or add oil. That means good luck in Chinese. Jiayo, jiayo, jiayo. See ya. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you would like to see my favorite piece of content that I put out every week, it is a short newsletter, 5 Bullet Friday. It's free. It's 5 bullet points with the coolest things that I have been finding, using, testing in a given week. I put it out every Friday. You can digest it in about 5 minutes. Take a look. 5 Bullet Friday.